Okay, so today we are looking at topic 1.3, which is energy and equilibria. So our significant ideas, the first one is the laws of thermodynamics govern the flow of energy in a system and the ability to do work. So we'll be looking at the first and second law of thermodynamics and how they affect energy flow in ecosystems. Our second significant idea is that systems can exist in alternative stable states or as equilibria between which there are tipping points. So we'll look at the two types of equilibria and what might cause those tipping points in the ecosystems. Our third major idea is that destabilizing positive feedback mechanisms will drive systems towards these tipping points, whereas stabilizing negative feedback mechanisms will resist such changes. So we'll look at the differences between positive and negative feedback and how they affect the equilibria of ecosystems. So first of all, just a reminder, with a system, you're always going to have inputs, storages, and outputs. So in ecosystems, you've got two basic processes. Your matter can cycle. We have a finite amount of nutrients on Earth, and so we've got our carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on that we will look at. Whereas energy flows. It does not cycle. All energy on Earth originates from the sun. It's used by plants in photosynthesis and then converted to a form that all other living things, all other organisms can use. So energy is a one-way flow. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy is neither created or destroyed. So whatever your energy input is going to be equal to your energy output. It can, however, change forms. With photosynthesis, you have solar energy coming in, you have chemical energy going out. So our light energy through photosynthesis is converted to glucose, which is energy stored in the carbon-carbon bonds in living things, and it's passed along as food. So you have your herbivore that eats the plant, you have your carnivore that eats the herbivore. So no new energy is created, it's just passed through the food chain. In a Earth system, you have your energy source, you have an energy storage, and then you have an output. So here you can see, if we look at a candle as an example. All right, so the candle, you have your energy source, which is the fire, and you're going to have two outputs. You will have light, which is your useful output, and then you have energy that is lost as heat, which is not useful unless you're trying to warm your hands over the candle. All right, so with photosynthesis, our inputs into the system, light energy, and our outputs are chemical and heat energy. So we have the same amount of energy, but we've converted it into two forms. Now, our second law of thermodynamics says that the entropy of a system increases over time. Well, entropy is simply a measure of the disorder. So when energy transforms from one type to another, it is actually degraded, and it reduces the energy available to do work. So that increases the entropy. Usually when energy is degraded, it is degraded into heat. So when we use energy, some of it is converted into work, and what is left is converted into heat. So if we look back at our same food chain, where we looked at the first law of thermodynamics, our solar energy enters the plant. Well, the plant's going to use some of that energy itself to drive photosynthesis and its own respiration. So it's going to lose some of the energy due to heat. So when the zebra eats the plant, he's going to use some of the energy, lose that as heat for his own body processes. And then when the lion chases the zebra, he's using energy to generate work, and he's losing heat. So that stored energy he got from his previous meal is being changed into useful work. So because of this, we are constantly losing energy from the food chain, which is why when we did our calculations earlier in the week, we saw that eating lower on the trophic level, like if you consume crops as opposed to livestock, that is much more energy efficient. So the second law also tells us that energy transfer is never 100% efficient. So let's assume that plants convert solar energy to glucose with about a 2% efficiency. Herbivores use only about 10% of the plants they consume. The rest they're used for their own body processes. And a carnivore's efficiency is only around 10%. So if we look at that in terms of total efficiency from solar energy all the way to the carnivore, we take that 2% that the plants converted into glucose, the 10% that the herbivores used, or times the 10% that the carnivore used, our total efficiency is only about 0.02%. So of all of that solar energy that went into the grass, very little of it actually makes it to that third trophic level. Most of it has been dispersed into the surrounding environment. All right, now moving on to Equilibria. As an open system, remember we said that most systems are open, ecosystems are generally pretty stable. So what equilibrium actually is, it's when a system returns to its original state if there's a disturbance. And that's maintained by negative feedback loops, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So when a system is in equilibria, its inputs are going to be equal to its output. So we can think of an ecosystem as the storage, and the energy that's input and output will remain constant. On a larger scale example, if we think of our planet, the temperature of our planet remains pretty constant as long as our energy input is equal to our energy output. So our energy input is solar energy, and then we re-radiate heat. Now, if we increase our greenhouse gases, then we increase the amount of heat that we're trapping, thus the temperature rises. So we've knocked it out of equilibrium. In steady state equilibrium, this is what we're going to see in most open systems. No long-term changes, but there may be oscillations in the short term. A great example is a predator-prey relationship. If we look at the snowshoe hare and the lynx populations, we see in the graph the hare is represented by the blue line and the lynx by the red. We see that when the hare population rises, the lynx have a greater food source and their population rises. Well, when the lynx population rises, they eat more hares, causing the hare population to drop. When the hare population drops, the lynx loses their food source and their population drops. But if we look at this, even though there are oscillations, the general pattern stays pretty steady. That's why we call this a steady state equilibrium. All right, think about it in terms of your body. If you get cold, you start to shiver. The shivering motion warms up your body. If your body gets too hot, you start to sweat. Sweating, the evaporation of the liquid, actually lowers your body temperature and cools you back down. So this is a way that your body can regulate its temperature. It doesn't stay exactly the same, but on average, your body's going to stay pretty steady. In a static equilibrium, which is rare, the components of a system remain constant. So we don't see that oscillation we saw in steady state equilibrium. So one example would be oxygen in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is about 21% oxygen today. Now, 4 billion years ago, there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere. It wasn't until we had cyanobacteria, which were our first photosynthesizers in the ocean, that were producing oxygen and releasing it into the air. So over time, oxygen levels rose, then we started seeing amphibians, reptiles, and ultimately mammals. And today, and for the past 2 billion years, we've had steady or static equilibrium with 21% of our atmosphere as O2. So looking at the difference between static and steady state. Static would stay exactly the same. Steady state, we have the oscillation. So most of our ecosystems are going to be regulated at a steady state equilibrium. All right, so I mentioned that negative feedback is what stabilizes those ecosystems. So negative feedback is called stabilizing feedback or steady state. And it's when the output reverses the operation of the same process or counteracts deviation. And we'll look at some examples so that this definition makes a little bit more sense. Positive feedback is destabilizing, so it drives the system towards a tipping point where usually it will adopt a new equilibrium. All right, so negative feedback is the way that ecosystems maintain homeostasis, which is its stable, constant condition. So usually there's a sequence of events that cause an effect that's the opposite direction to that original stimulus. So it brings it back to equilibrium. So if we think about that example with the links in the hair, that's a great example of negative feedback. Another would be a population of insects that remain the same. So you're going to have individuals that are born, which would increase the population, but you also have insects that die, which decreases the population. So it's changing in opposite directions, thus that oscillation. And then going back to our example with the human body, our temperature oscillates, but there's systems in place to keep that in check. Now, positive feedback it continues to change in the same direction. So in this first example, when temperature rises, that causes permafrost to thaw. When permafrost thaws, that releases methane containing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse effect, is a greenhouse gas, which traps heat, causing the temperature to rise, and that just continues the cycle. Another example, if you have disruptive sleep, that causes fatigue. Fatigue diminishes your ability to cope with stress. Stress disrupts your sleep, which further diminishes your ability to cope with stress. So that would be another example of a positive feedback loop. And then human population. As the births per year increase, human population increases. When population increases, births per year increase, which is why our population is growing exponentially. Usually, when you plot data that is following a positive feedback loop, it does result in exponential growth. Now, resilience is when an ecosystem avoids tipping points and maintains that stability. So if you have a large ecosystem that has negative feedback loops in place, then it is going to be a resilient ecosystem. The more diversity you have can also increase the resilience of an ecosystem. So what that does, it affects their speed of response to change. And we're going to refer to that speed as a time lag. So humans affect the resilience of these systems because we reduce the storages. So take deforestation, for example. We also reduce diversity. Oftentimes there are delays in feedback loops when the time from when there's an input to when there is a response is often too late to be able to take care of it before the tipping point is reached. Also, we talked about how modeling systems often simplifies, and so we're not taking into account the complexity. So tipping point is the maximum amount of change that will destabilize a system. So either it causes it to reach a new equilibrium or a new stable state. So positive feedback is what drives a system to its tipping point, and usually it's long-lasting and difficult to change. And then, as we said before, there's a time lag between the actual event and the evidence of the change, so a lot of times it's too late to actually do something once you've reached the tipping point. So a couple of examples to finish up. The first is eutrophication. That may or may not be a term that you've heard before. But if you look at the picture there, whenever you see that pond scum, that's usually a result of eutrophication. So what happens, nutrients or fertilizers run off from the land, are added to the lake or pond, which causes algae blooms because of those increased nutrients. When you have increased algae that's covering the surface of the pond, the sunlight cannot reach the lake floor. So oxygen levels in the lake decrease because you no longer have photosynthesis on the floor. Also, as the algae die and decompose and other organisms die and decompose, decomposers release carbon dioxide, and so that further lowers the amount of dissolved oxygen. So it's reached its tipping point. That's another example of positive feedback. Okay, and then the second example here is species extinction. So using this particular species of rhinoceros that lives in Bangladesh, they have been overhunted, they've been poached for horns and medicine. So in addition to that, habitat loss because of human destruction of their habitats, has caused the population to significantly drop. There are only 50 to 60 left in existence.